The streets smelled of bread before the sun even rose. Not the warm, soft scent we imagine today, but something sharp and sour, mixed with the heavy odor of smoke, damp wood, and too many people packed too close together. Somewhere in the maze of narrow alleys, a boy's voice called out, his words breaking the soft murmur of the waking town. "Hot pies! Fresh this morning! Hot pies!" His voice was thin, carried by the early mist that hugged the crooked wooden buildings. But even as he called, no one answered. Few could afford to eat so early, not in this part of town. It was the cheap quarter where vendors shouted louder than they sold, where most people worked only to eat, and eating meant whatever you could afford, even if it wasn't fresh or clean or entirely safe. The boy, no older than 12, shifted the basket in his arms. He looked tired already, his thin arms trembling slightly from holding it. The pies inside were wrapped in rough cloth, but steam still slipped through the fabric, rising in soft curls into the chilly air. If he sold all of them before midday, he might get a single copper coin for himself. If not, his master would take them back and feed the old ones to the pigs. This was how most street vendors lived, day by day, coin by coin. They were the life of medieval towns, filling the streets with sound, color, and movement. But for every cheerful cry of fresh apples or fine fish, there was a struggle hiding behind it. Every vendor fought for a small corner, for a handful of customers, and sometimes just for the right to stand there without being kicked away by a bigger, stronger seller, or worse, by a guard expecting a bribe. The boy stopped for a moment at a crossing where two alleys met. The stones under his boots were slick from the night's rain, and water collected in shallow puddles. His reflection wavered as he looked down, his face thin and pale. He glanced up when he heard another voice shouting not far away. "Turnips! Good turnips, cheap turnips!" The voice belonged to a woman who had already claimed the better spot near the main street. She had a wooden cart piled high with vegetables, though half of them were soft and bruised. She saw the boy watching and gave him a sharp look, one that said, "Don't even think about standing near me." He turned away quickly, moving to the edge of the square instead, where fewer people passed. But this was how it was. The best spots were owned, claimed by those who could pay the market tax or had a deal with the local guards. Those who couldn't had to keep moving, always chased to the edges where customers were fewer and coins were rarer. A bell rang somewhere deeper in the town, slow and heavy. It meant the main market square was opening, the richer merchants were setting up their stalls, and soon the narrow streets would flood with people. The boy took a breath and started shouting again. "Hot pies! Fresh pies!" A man finally stopped, tugging at the edge of his sleeve. His clothes were rough, his beard thick with crumbs from something else he had already eaten. "How much?" the man asked. The boy hesitated, glancing at the pie in his hand. His master had told him the price, but if he set it too high, the man would walk away. If he set it too low, he'd have to pay the difference later from his own coins. "2 for a farthing," he said carefully. The man frowned, his eyebrows sinking. "Too much. 1 for a farthing." The boy swallowed. He could argue, but he had no right to refuse. Vendors like him weren't supposed to anger customers. With a quiet nod, he handed over a pie and took the coin. It was bent and dirty, but it was something. The man left without a word, and the boy watched him go, his small hands tightening on the basket. He looked down at the remaining pies. There were still too many left. As the sun rose higher, the streets filled with noise. Vendors shouted over one another, calling out their goods in loud, rhythmic voices, almost like songs. "Fine salt. Best salt from the coast. Sweet apples, only a penny. Fish, fresh from the river, still alive." The smell of food mixed with less pleasant things. The sour tang of waste, the sharp sting of smoke from fires, and the damp, heavy scent of too many unwashed bodies moving too close together. Everywhere, people bargained, argued, and sometimes fought. A woman slapped a man's hand when he tried to steal an onion. A guard dragged a vendor by the arm, demanding his market fee. A dog darted between legs, snatching a piece of bread from a distracted customer. In the middle of it all, the boy kept shouting, his voice growing hoarse. But every time he looked around, he saw the same thing. Bigger sellers with better spots, carts full of food, and hands exchanging coins again and again. His basket still felt heavy in his arms. By midday, the sun pressed down, making the narrow streets feel even smaller. The boy sat on a stone step for a moment, resting his tired legs. A woman passed by, wrinkling her nose as if he were in her way. He lowered his head, his eyes on the ground. He wondered if he would sell enough to eat tonight. He wondered if the pies would go bad before he found enough customers. And then, in the middle of those worries, he heard something, soft footsteps stopping near him. When he looked up, a girl stood there. She was about his age, maybe a little older, wearing a faded brown dress with patches on the sleeves. Her eyes were sharp, quick, and they looked at the basket first, then at him. "How much for all of them?" she asked. The boy blinked, not sure he had heard her right. "All of them?" She nodded. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, she looked over her shoulder, glancing nervously at something behind her. The boy followed her gaze and saw two men moving quickly through the crowd. They weren't guards, but they moved like they were searching for someone. The girl turned back to him, her voice urgent now. "Please, tell me the price. Quickly." The boy felt his chest tighten. Something was wrong. He didn't know who she was, but the way she looked at him made his stomach twist with unease. And then, before he could answer, one of the men spotted her. "There she is," he shouted, pushing through the crowd. The girl grabbed the boy's arm, her fingers cold despite the heat of the day. "Run," she whispered. For a heartbeat, he froze. He was just a vendor, just a boy trying to sell pies. This wasn't his problem, but her grip was tight, her eyes wide, and the men were coming fast. The boy's heart pounded as he looked at the basket in his hands, then at the girl. Should he run? Should he stay? The crowd shifted, voices rising as the two men pushed closer. The girl pulled his arm again, and before he could decide, something happened that would change everything for him, and for the other vendors who would soon find themselves caught in something far bigger than selling food on the streets. The boy didn't think anymore. His feet moved before his mind caught up. The girl's hand pulled him forward, weaving through the thick crowd, the basket of pies bouncing against his arm. People shouted as they shoved past, some angry, some just annoyed. The boy mumbled quick apologies, but the girl didn't bother. She pushed through like someone who had done this before, her quick steps darting between carts and barrels. "Where are we going?" the boy asked breathlessly, trying to keep up. "Somewhere safe," she said, not looking back. The boy glanced over his shoulder. The two men were still behind them, moving fast. One of them was tall and broad, his face red from shouting as he forced his way through the crowd. The other was thinner, his sharp eyes scanning every turn they made. The boy's heart raced, not just from running, but from fear. He wasn't supposed to get involved in things like this. Street vendors learned early, don't get noticed, don't get in trouble, don't get dragged into anyone else's mess. But now he was in it, whether he wanted to be or not. The girl led him down a narrow side alley where the buildings leaned close together, their wooden beams dark with age and dampness. The smell of rotting vegetables and stale water filled the air. A cat darted across their path, knocking over a clay jug. The boy stumbled but kept running. "Why are they chasing you?" he finally asked. The girl didn't answer at first. Her breath came fast, but her steps didn't slow. "They think I stole something," she said finally. "Did you?" She didn't reply. The boy felt a lump form in his throat. If she had stolen something, and if the guards found him with her, he could be punished too. Vendors weren't treated kindly when accused of theft. Many lost their goods or were whipped publicly, whether guilty or not. The alley opened into a wider back street, quieter than the main market, but still busy with vendors stacking their goods. A man selling dried fish shouted at them as they ran past, his hand waving angrily. The smell of the fish hung heavy in the air, mixing with the stink of wet straw. The girl stopped suddenly, ducking behind a stack of wooden crates. She pulled the boy with her, crouching low. The boy clutched his basket, his breath quick and shaky. The two men appeared at the other end of the street, scanning for them. The taller one cursed under his breath, pushing past another vendor's stall. The girl leaned closer to the boy. "Stay quiet," she whispered. The boy swallowed hard and nodded. His knees felt weak, his back pressed against the rough wood of the crates. The men stopped nearby, their voices low but clear enough to hear. "She went this way," the taller one growled. "Check the alleys," the thin one said. His voice was sharp, like someone used to giving orders. The boy held his breath, trying to make himself small. A fly buzzed near his ear, but he didn't move. The girl's hand was still on his arm, her grip tight. The men moved past slowly, glancing between the stalls. The boy's heart thumped so loud he was sure they could hear it. Finally, after what felt like forever, the men continued down the street, their footsteps fading. The girl let go of his arm and exhaled. "We need to move," she said quietly. The boy hesitated. "Why me? Why did you pull me with you?" She looked at him then, her sharp eyes studying his face. "Because you look like someone who won't tell." He didn't know if that was supposed to be a compliment or an insult. The girl stood, peeking around the crates to make sure the men were gone. Then she turned to him again. "Do you still want to sell those pies? Or do you want to earn more than you've ever made in a day?" The boy blinked, unsure what she meant. "What are you talking about?" She tilted her head, as if she couldn't believe he didn't understand. "You're a street vendor, aren't you? You sell for someone else. You get scrapped for doing all the work. But there's a way to make real money if you're not scared to take risks." The boy frowned. "What kind of risks?" The girl smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "The kind that make those men chase you." The boy's stomach tightened. "I can't steal," he said quickly. "Not stealing," she said. "Trading. Selling things people really want. Not old pies or spoiled vegetables. There are ways to get them. Ways that aren't exactly allowed." The boy looked down at his basket, the steam from the pies almost gone now. He thought of his master, of the long days shouting in the streets, of the nights going to bed hungry because he didn't sell enough. The girl seemed to read his thoughts. "You can stay here, selling pies until you're too tired to stand, or you can come with me. But you have to decide now." The boy hesitated. His whole life, he had been told to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble. But something in the way she looked at him, like she believed he could do more than just shout in a street corner, made him pause. Before he could answer, a shout echoed from the street nearby. The two men were back, closer this time. The girl grabbed his arm again. "No time. Are you coming or not?" The boy's heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to stay, to keep selling, to avoid trouble. But his feet moved on their own again. "Fine," he said, almost surprising himself. "I'm coming." The girl's smile was quick, almost approving. "Good. Follow me." She led him down another twisting alley, moving fast and sure as if she knew every corner of the town. The boy struggled to keep up, the basket in his arms knocking against his ribs. Finally, they stopped in front of a wooden door set into the side of an old, crumbling building. The girl knocked 3 times, sharp and quick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open, just a little. A pair of dark eyes looked out, watching them carefully. "It's me," the girl said. The door opened wider, and the boy caught a glimpse of the person inside. A man with a scar across his cheek, his arms thick and strong. The smell of spices and something sweeter drifted from the room beyond. The man's eyes shifted to the boy. "Who's he?" "A friend," the girl said quickly. "He wants to work." The man studied the boy for a long moment, his gaze sharp. Then he nodded once and stepped aside. "Get in," he said. The boy hesitated at the doorway, his heart thudding. He looked back once, down the empty alley, at the life he had always known, the shouting, the begging, the endless coins that never seemed enough. Then he stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. What waited inside would change not just his life, but the lives of every vendor who scraped for coins on these streets. And soon, the quiet world of selling pies and turnips would turn into something far more dangerous than anyone expected. The room smelled of spices, sharp and strange, mixed with the heavier scent of old wood and smoke. The boy stepped carefully, his boots pressing into a rough floor that creaked under his weight. The place was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a low beam, its weak flame casting long, uneven shadows against the walls. The man with the scar closed the door behind them, the sound echoing in the small space. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy again. "Does he even know what we do here?" the man asked the girl. "Not yet," she replied. The boy shifted uncomfortably, clutching his basket. "What do you do here?" he asked quietly. The man smirked, though it wasn't friendly. We make a living. A better one than shouting for pennies in the street. The boy glanced at the girl. She nodded slightly, as if encouraging him to listen. The man turned and walked deeper into the room, motioning for them to follow. They passed a table piled with cloth sacks, some tied tightly, some half open, revealing glints of different things: salt, dried herbs, bits of fine fabric. The boy stared. Vendors like him sold scraps, whatever they could get from the main markets. But here, these were things people wanted. Things worth real money. "This is how the street really works," the man said, his voice low and steady. "The market stalls, the carts, the shouting, that's just what the town lets you see. But the best sellers, the ones who make more than a few coppers a week, they don't play by the rules." The boy swallowed, his fingers tightening around the basket. "Is this stealing?" The man glanced at him. "Sometimes. Sometimes not. We get things before the market does. We buy them cheap, or we get them from people who don't ask questions. The guard don't care as long as they get their share. Everyone eats. Everyone wins." The boy hesitated. He had heard whispers about vendors who worked in secret, who sold special goods behind closed doors. But he had never imagined he would stand in a place like this. The girl stepped closer to him. "You won't survive long out there selling pies for a master who barely feeds you," she said softly. "This is your chance to sell something people will fight over. You'll earn enough to buy your own stall, maybe even your own cart one day." The boy looked down at his basket. His pies were already cooling, their crust softening. Even if he sold them all, he would barely earn enough for a crust of bread tonight. The man moved to another table and untied a small sack. He poured a bit of its contents into his hand and held it out. The boy leaned closer, his eyes widening. "Is that sugar?" The man nodded. "Straight from the port. The rich pay silver for this. The common folk will pay whatever they have left if you sell it cheap enough." The boy had only tasted sugar once years ago, when a kind woman had given him a tiny piece of candied fruit. He still remembered the way it melted on his tongue, sweeter than anything he had ever eaten. The man poured the sugar back into the sack. "We have spices too. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves. Some dried fruits. Sometimes even wine. You sell these on the streets quietly, to the right people, and you'll never have to beg for customers again." The boy hesitated. "But what if the guards catch me?" The man shrugged. "Then you give them a coin, and they walk away. That's how this town works." The girl looked at him again, her sharp eyes steady. "You want a better life, didn't you? This is it." The boy's chest tightened. He thought of the mornings he had woken before sunrise, the long hours shouting until his voice hurt, the nights go to sleep hungry. This was dangerous, yes, but it was also hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The man watched him waiting. "So," he said finally, "are you in or not?" The boy looked from the man to the girl, then down at his pies. Slowly, he nodded. "I'm in," he said quietly. The man gave a small nod of approval. "Good. You'll start tomorrow. You'll sell a little at first, only to people we tell you. If you prove you can keep quiet and not get caught, you'll get more." The boy set his basket down, his hands trembling slightly. This was it. His life as a simple street vendor was over. The girl smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried something unreadable. "You made the right choice," she said. The boy wanted to believe her. The man turned back to his work, sorting through sacks and jars, while the girl motioned for the boy to follow her. She led him to a corner where a wooden bench sat against the wall. He sat down, his legs still tired from running, his mind racing with questions. "Do you trust him?" he asked her quietly, glancing toward the man. The girl shrugged. "As much as anyone can trust someone here. But he's been doing this for years. If anyone can teach you how to survive, it's him." The boy nodded slowly, though doubt still sat heavy in his chest. They stayed there until the sun began to set, the light outside turning the narrow window to a soft orange glow. Finally, the man gave him a small pouch filled with something that smelled faintly sweet. "Take this tomorrow," the man said. "Sell it only to the names she gives you. Don't ask questions, don't talk to anyone else, and don't let the guards stop you. If they do, give them this." He handed the boy a single copper coin, thicker and cleaner than any he had ever held. The boy nodded, his fingers curling around the pouch. The girl walked him back to the door. As she opened it, The cold evening air swept in, carrying the distant sound of vendors closing their stalls. "Be careful," she said softly. The boy looked at her, wondering for the first time who she really was, where she had come from, and why she had chosen to help him. "I will," he said. She gave him one last glance before closing the door behind him. The boy stepped back into the street, the sky now streaked with gray clouds. He walked slowly, the pouch hidden under his shirt. Every shadow felt deeper. Every passing stranger seemed to glance at him too long. He had no idea that tomorrow would be nothing like he expected, because by the time the sun rose again, someone would be dead in the market square, and the boy would find himself caught in something far darker than just selling secret goods. The boy barely slept that night. He lay on the thin straw mat in the corner of the room he shared with two other vendor apprentices, staring at the dark ceiling beams. The pouch lay hidden under his blanket, its faintly sweet smell lingering in the air. He kept touching it, as if to make sure it was still there, as if it might vanish if he let go. Outside, the town was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant sound of boots on cobblestones. But the quiet did little to calm his mind. He kept hearing the man's voice, "Sell it only to the names she gives you." He didn't even know who those people were yet. What if he made a mistake? What if the guards caught him? And what if the girl had lied? He turned on his side, staring at the faint light seeping through the cracks in the shutters. He didn't know her name, not really. She had never told him. All he knew was that she had pulled him into this, and now there was no going back. By dawn, he was already up. He dressed quickly, pulling his worn boots on and tucking the pouch under his shirt, pressing it against his chest like a secret no one could know. The streets were still wet from the night's dew, the air cool and sharp. Vendors were already setting up, their carts creaking as they dragged them into place. The familiar cries began to rise. Fresh fish. Good onions, cheap. But now the boy noticed something he never had before. Some vendors didn't shout at all. They sat quietly, nodding at certain customers, exchanging goods with quick, careful hands. Had they been doing this all along, right in front of him? The girl appeared out of nowhere, stepping from a side alley with the same quick, quiet grace she had yesterday. She carried nothing in her hands, but her sharp eyes scanned the crowd as if she were always watching for something. "You came," she said, her voice low. "I said I would," he replied. She studied him for a moment, then handed him a small piece of parchment with 3 names written in hurried ink. "Only them," she reminded him. "Don't talk to anyone else. Don't even say you have anything to sell." The boy looked at the names. He didn't recognize them, though one had a symbol drawn beside it, an apple. "They'll find you," she added. "You don't find them." He frowned. "What if I can't find them at all?" The girl gave him a look that was half amusement, half warning. "If they want what you have, they'll find you. Just keep walking like you always do." And then, before he could ask more, she slipped back into the crowd, disappearing as easily as she had appeared. The boy took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He picked up his basket of pies, still the same ones he had to sell for his master, or else he would raise suspicion, and started walking his usual route. At first, nothing felt different. People passed by, without looking, too busy haggling over vegetables or counting their coins. The boy shouted, just as he always did, "Hot pies! Fresh pies!" But now every face he saw felt like it could be watching him. Every glance felt too long. He gripped the basket tightly, his other hand pressed against the pouch hidden under his shirt. The first name found him near the butcher's stall. A heavy-set woman with a scarf, pulled low over her forehead, stopped beside him, her eyes sharp. "How much for the pies?" she asked loudly. "2 for a farthing," he said, keeping his voice steady. She looked him over, then tilted her head slightly. "And what about the special ones?" The boy froze for a moment, then remembered the apple symbol beside her name. He nodded faintly. "They're fresh," he said quietly. She held out a coin, slipping it into his hand faster than most customers ever did. At the same time, her other hand brushed against his, taking the small wrapped portion of sugar from the pouch under his shirt. No one else seemed to notice. The woman nodded and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if nothing had happened. The boy's heart pounded. It had worked. By midday, he had found the other 2 names, or rather, they had found him. Both transactions were quick, quiet, and just as careful as the first. By the time the sun stood high in the sky, his pouch was empty, replaced by coins heavier than he had ever held before. He wanted to smile, to feel proud, but something in his chest still felt tight. Every time a guard passed, his heart jumped. Every time someone looked at him too long, his hands trembled. As the market began to calm in the late afternoon, the boy sat on the edge of a stone step, pretending to rest. He counted the coins under his breath, hiding them under the cloth in his basket. It was more than he had earned in a week of selling pies. But just as he began to feel a flicker of relief, a shout cut through the air. "Thief! Stop him!" The boy looked up quickly. Across the square, a man was running, shoving through the crowd, clutching something under his coat. Behind him, two guards pushed people aside, their swords clanging against their belts as they chased him. The boy's stomach sank when he recognized the man. He had seen him this morning, another vendor, one of the quiet ones who never shouted. The man tripped, crashing into a cart of cabbages. The guards were on him instantly, dragging him up roughly. "Where did you get this?" one of them barked, pulling a small sack from his coat. The boy couldn't see what was inside, but he had a sinking feeling he already knew. The crowd murmured as the guards twisted the man's arms behind his back. One of them turned to the other, his voice low but firm. "Take him to the square. The sheriff will want to make an example of this one." The vendor shouted, struggling, but it was no use. The guards dragged him through the crowd, and people stepped back quickly, some whispering, others looking away as if they had seen this before. The boy's chest tightened. If the guards had caught him instead, if someone had told them about the pouch. A cold wind swept through the square, though the sun was still shining. The boy gripped his basket tighter, his mind racing. He needed to get back to the old building, to the girl, to give the coins and finish what he had started. But as he stood, another sound rose in the distance, a low murmur that grew louder, closer, until he could make out the words. "Execution," someone whispered beside him. "They're hanging him now, right in the market square." The boy's stomach twisted, his hands trembling against the basket. And then, through the murmuring crowd, he saw the girl again. She was standing across the street, her face pale, her sharp eyes fixed not on him, but on the path where the guards were dragging the man. Something about her expression, tight, worried, almost fearful, made the boy's chest grow heavier. Because she didn't look surprised. She looked like she had expected this to happen. And as the boy stared at her, one terrible thought formed in his mind, colder than the wind around him. What if this wasn't just bad luck? What if someone had told the guards? And worse, what if he was next? The boy couldn't move for a long moment. He stood frozen in the crowd, the noise of the marketplace fading into a dull hum in his ears. People were still talking, still selling, still shouting, but for him, everything had gone quiet. His eyes stayed on the girl across the street. On the way, she kept glancing at the guards and then back toward the alley as if deciding whether to leave or stay. She turned suddenly, disappearing into the crowd without looking at him once. The boy's chest felt heavy as he forced himself to move, his legs stiff. He followed the slow-moving tide of people heading toward the main square. Whispers carried through the air. They caught him with stolen goods. The sheriff's making an example. Better to stay away. They'll search anyone they suspect. The boy wanted to turn and run back to the old building, to give the coins and be done with it. But if he turned away now, it would look strange. So he kept walking with the others, his basket held tightly against his chest, the coins hidden under the cloth inside. The square was already filling with people by the time he arrived. Vendors stood with folded arms, customers craned their necks, and children sat on barrels to get a better view. In the center, the guards dragged the captured vendor to a wooden platform, his face red from shouting. The sheriff, a broad man with a thick beard and a fine leather coat, stood waiting with two other guards at his side. The boy edged closer, his heart beating faster with every step. The sheriff raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. His voice carried easily over the square. This man was caught selling stolen goods, cheating honest merchants, and breaking the peace of this market. The law is clear. Theft will not be tolerated. The vendor shook his head furiously. "I didn't steal it. I bought it. I paid for it." The sheriff didn't even glance at him. "The punishment is public," he said, his voice firm. Let everyone here see what happens to thieves. The boy's fingers tightened on the basket. He looked at the vendor's face, the desperation in his eyes, and felt a sharp twist in his stomach. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The guards pushed the vendor to his knees, tying his hands tightly. The crowd murmured, some nodding, some looking away. This wasn't rare. Vendors were punished often for cheating, for lying about weights, for stealing, but something about this felt different. The boy looked around and saw the girl again, standing at the far edge of the square, half hidden behind a stall. She didn't look at the vendor. Her eyes scanned the crowd instead, sharp and searching, as if she were watching for someone else. The boy's thoughts raced. She hadn't been surprised when the guards caught him. She hadn't looked shocked now. Did she know this was going to happen? Had she told him? A cold feeling crept into his chest. The sheriff gave the order, and the guards pulled the vendor to his feet again. One of them held up the small sack of goods they had taken from him. The boy caught a glimpse of what was inside: dark peppercorns, a little bit of sugar, and a handful of dried figs. Things worth more than most vendors could ever afford to sell. The sheriff held the sack high. This is what greed brings, he said loudly. If anyone here is caught selling goods like these without permission, you will meet the same punishment. The boy's mouth went dry. The sheriff wasn't just talking to the crowd. He was warning them. The punishment wasn't death, not today. The vendor was dragged to the edge of the platform, where a thick wooden post stood. The guards tied his hands to it, and another guard stepped forward with a whip. The boy turned his face away, his stomach twisting, but the sharp crack of the first strike made him flinch. The vendor shouted, his voice echoing across the square. People murmured, some turning away, others watching with cold, quiet faces. The boy couldn't stay. His heart pounded too fast, his legs too weak. He turned, slipping back into the crowd, moving as quickly as he could without drawing attention. The girl was gone when he looked for her again. He didn't stop walking until he reached the narrow alley leading to the old building. His hands shook as he knocked on the door, 3 quick taps just like yesterday. The door opened, and the scarred man stood there, his eyes narrowing when he saw the boy's pale face. "You're back," the man said flatly. "Come in." The boy stepped inside, the familiar smell of spices and wood wrapping around him again. The girl was already there, sitting on the bench in the corner. She looked calm, almost too calm, as if she had been waiting for him. The boy set his basket down, his fingers fumbling as he pulled the coins from under the cloth. He placed them on the table, his hands trembling. The man counted them quickly, nodding once. "Good. You did well for your first day." The boy didn't answer. His mind was still full of the vendor's shouting, of the sheriff's warning, of the sharp crack of the whip. The man glanced at him. "What's wrong with you? Did anyone follow you?" "No," the boy said quickly, shaking his head. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You look upset," she said softly. "Something happened, didn't it?" The boy swallowed hard, his voice low. "They caught someone. A vendor. He was selling the same things." The man didn't react much. "It happens," he said simply. "Some people aren't careful. That's why you listen to us and no one else." The girl's eyes stayed on the boy, searching his face. "Who was it?" "I don't know his name," the boy said, his words quiet. "But they made an example of him in the square." The man waved a hand dismissively. "Then you know what happens to fools. You keep quiet, you keep to the names we give you, and you won't end up like him." The boy nodded, though his chest still felt heavy. The girl finally looked away, glancing toward the window as if she had lost interest. But something in her expression made the boy uneasy again. She wasn't worried. She wasn't surprised. The man pushed a small pouch toward him. "Take this tomorrow. Same names, same rules. And don't bring your master's pies near us again. Too many people see you with them. You need to look like you're working for yourself now." The boy stared at the pouch, his fingers hesitating. "Take it," the man repeated, his voice firmer. The boy slowly reached out, closing his hand around it. As he did, the girl finally looked at him again, her sharp eyes meeting his. She gave him the faintest smile, almost unreadable. Something in that look made the boy's heart sink deeper. Because for the first time, he wondered if he had stepped into something he couldn't escape, even if he wanted to. Outside, the evening bells began to ring, echoing through the streets. The boy tucked the pouch under his shirt, but his mind stayed on the square, on the whip cracking through the air, and on the sheriff's words. The town was watching now. The guards were watching. And tomorrow, someone else might not be as lucky as the vendor had been. The boy left the building with the pouch hidden carefully, but as he stepped into the cool evening air, he had the strange feeling that someone was already following him. He glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the feeling didn't leave. And as he disappeared into the winding alleys, he couldn't shake the thought that the real danger wasn't the guards at all. It might be the very people he was working for. The boy walked home slowly, keeping to the shadows. Every creak of a cart wheel, every distant shout made him glance over his shoulder. But the streets were thinning now as the market wound down for the evening. Vendors packed their goods, their tired faces half hidden under the fading light. He passed a woman crouched beside her empty basket, her hands trembling as she counted a few thin coins. She had been selling onions since dawn, her cries hoarse and cracking by midday. Now she sat slumped against the wall, her head bowed as if too tired to stand. Farther down, two men argued loudly over a broken wooden scale. One accused the other of cheating him, of cutting the weights to steal coins. Their voices carried sharp and angry, but no one stopped to help. In the vendor's world, arguments like that ended one of two ways. Someone lost their goods, or someone lost their teeth. The boy had seen worse before. A fish seller beaten by guards for standing too close to a tax stall. A bread vendor having his cart overturned because he couldn't pay his market fee. Vendors lived on the edge of survival every day. But now, after what had happened in the square, the boy saw it all differently. Every tired face, every desperate bargain. Any of them could be dragged away next, accused of theft, whether guilty or not. And he was standing closer to that danger than ever. By the time he reached the small room he shared with the other apprentices, night had fully fallen. The streets glowed faintly with lanterns, their soft flickering light stretching shadows long across the ground. He slipped inside quietly, laying on a straw mat and pretending to sleep. But his mind refused to rest. He thought of the vendor tied to the post, his face contorted in pain. He thought of the sheriff's warning, and he thought of the girl's calm expression, as if she had expected it all. The next morning, the sun broke through thin clouds, spilling pale light over the town. The boy rose before the others, tucking the new pouch under his shirt. It felt heavier today, not just from the goods inside, but from what it meant. The streets were already alive with noise. Vendors called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and guards stood at corners with watchful eyes. The smell of bread and fish mixed with the sharper scent of smoke from morning fires. The boy started his usual route, but now he felt every glance. Every passing customer seemed suspicious. The pouch pressed against his chest like a weight. He passed a group of vendors arguing over spots near the main street. The best places were always fought over. One man shoved another, nearly knocking him into a barrel of apples. The guards ignored them. Unless they were paid to intervene, they didn't care. The boy forced himself to keep walking. It didn't take long for the first name on the list to find him. A thin man with a scar across his lip stepped out from behind a fruit cart, giving a quick nod. "Do you have it?" the man asked under his breath. The boy nodded slightly, glancing around before slipping the wrapped goods into his hand. The man pressed a coin into his palm and disappeared as quickly as he had come. The second name came an hour later, a woman pretending to examine his pies before whispering for the special goods. The boy's hands shook slightly each time, but the exchanges went smoothly. Too smoothly. By midday, he had only one name left on the list, but as the hours passed, no one approached him. He kept walking his route, his voice calling out for pies as usual, but his eyes scanned the crowd constantly. Finally, just as he began to think the last buyer wouldn't come, a man appeared near the edge of the square. He wore a dark cloak despite the warm day, and his face was partly hidden under the hood. He didn't move closer, only raised his hand slightly, as if signaling the boy. The boy's chest tightened. Something felt wrong. The others had been quick, quiet, almost casual. But this man stood still, his eyes watching too closely. The boy hesitated. Should he go to him? The man tilted his head slightly, as if impatient. The boy forced himself to move, weaving through the crowd until he stood a few steps away. "You're the last one," the boy said softly. The man's lips curled into the faintest smile. "I know." He reached into his cloak, pulling out a coin, but something about the way he moved made the boy's stomach twist. His hand didn't stop at the coin. The boy's eyes widened when he caught the faint glint of metal, a badge, the kind guards carried hidden when they wanted to catch someone by surprise. The boy stepped back quickly, his heart racing. The man's hand shot forward, grabbing his arm. "Don't run," the man said firmly, his voice low. "You don't want to make this worse." But the boy didn't listen. His instinct screamed louder than his fear. He twisted his arm free and darted into the crowd, his basket knocking against his side as he ran. "Stop him," the man shouted. The crowd turned, people stepping aside as the boy pushed past. Vendors cursed, a woman dropped a sack of apples, and a guard at the corner looked up sharply. The boy's breath came fast, his boots slipping on the damp stones. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear footsteps chasing him. He darted down a narrow alley, the walls closing in around him, his chest burning with every breath. The pouch pressed hard against his chest, the goods inside, now feeling like a curse. He turned sharply, slipping through a smaller passage between two buildings. His thin frame barely fit, but it gave him a few precious seconds. He could hear the man cursing behind him, the sound of heavier boots struggling to follow. Finally, the boy burst out onto a quieter back street, his heart pounding. He didn't stop running until he ducked behind a stack of barrels, crouching low. The street was silent except for his ragged breathing. He waited, listening. Footsteps passed nearby, but didn't stop. The man must have lost him, at least for now. The boy pressed his forehead against the barrel, his hands shaking. He couldn't go back to the square. He couldn't even go home. He had only one place left to run. The boy stood, his legs trembling, and slipped through the back streets, heading toward the old building. When he finally knocked, the scarred man opened the door, his sharp eyes narrowing when he saw the boy's face. "What happened?" the man demanded. The boy stepped inside quickly, his breath still fast. "A guard. He tried to catch me. I ran." The man's jaw tightened. "Did he see what you had?" "I don't know," the boy said, his voice trembling. The girl was already sitting at the table, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. The man cursed under his breath, pacing the room. "This is bad. If they were watching you, they might be watching others too." The boy looked at him, his chest tightening. "What do we do?" The man stopped pacing, turning to the girl. "We can't keep selling like this. Someone's talking." The girl finally looked up, her sharp eyes meeting his. "Then we find out who." The boy swallowed hard, his heart still racing. But as the girl's gaze lingered on him, calm and almost too steady, a terrible thought crossed his mind again. What if they already knew who had been talking? And what if they thought it might be him? The scarred man slammed his palm against the table, making the coins jump. His jaw was tight, and his eyes flicked from the girl to the boy, then back again. "Someone's giving the guards names," he said in a low voice. "They don't move this fast unless they're sure. That vendor yesterday, the one they whipped, he wasn't caught by accident." The boy swallowed, standing stiff near the door. He wanted to speak, to insist it wasn't him, but his throat felt dry. The girl sat silently, her chin resting lightly on her hand, watching the man pace. "We can't keep this up if someone's talking," the man continued. "One more mistake, and the guard will tear through every alley looking for us." The girl's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then we find the leak." The man stopped pacing, turning to her sharply. "And how do you suggest we do that? Ask everyone nicely if they've been whispering to the sheriff." The girl shrugged slightly. "You have your ways. People talk when they're scared. Make them talk." The boy's stomach twisted at her tone. There was no hesitation, no doubt in her voice. The man rubbed his scarred cheek, thinking. "We'll meet tonight," he said finally. "All of them. Anyone who's been selling for us." His eyes flicked to the boy, sharp and assessing. Even the new ones. The boy's chest tightened. He didn't want to meet anyone. He didn't want to sit in a room full of people who might already be looking for someone to blame. The girl glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before looking back at the man. "If there's a traitor, we'll know." The man nodded once, his decision final. Go home for now, he told the boy. Stay quiet. And don't get caught carrying anything else until we say so. The boy hesitated. What about tomorrow's list? There is no list, the man said firmly. Not until we're sure we're clean. The boy nodded quickly, clutching his basket tightly. But as he turned to leave, the girl's voice stopped him. Wait. He turned back to see her standing now, her sharp eyes on him. You didn't say much when you came in, she said softly, almost casually. The guard, what did he say to you? Did he call you by name? The boy shook his head quickly. No, he just grabbed me. I don't even think he knew who I was. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face as if trying to read something in it. After a long pause, she finally nodded. Go then. The boy stepped out into the cool air, his heart still pounding. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he wandered through the side streets, keeping to the quieter paths. He couldn't stop thinking about the meeting tonight, about the way the man's eyes had lingered on him, about the way the girl had looked at him, as if weighing something in her mind. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he was the one talking to the guards? He thought of the vendor in the square, of the sharp crack of the whip. If the vendors punished their own, what would they do to someone they believed was betraying them? The boy's stomach churned. He stopped near a narrow alley where a group of other vendors sat in a loose circle, their baskets empty, their faces tired. They weren't part of the secret trade. They were just regular sellers, scraping for every coin. A man with gray streaks in his hair muttered bitterly. Did you see them whip that man yesterday? Said he was stealing. Bah, half of us sell scraps from broken carts, and no one cares. But you sell one thing they don't like, and suddenly you're a thief. A younger woman shook her head. The sheriff's making examples. People talk about secret vendors selling sugar and spices. They're blaming all of us now. Guard stopped me this morning, searched my whole basket. The gray-haired man spat on the ground. They don't care if we're guilty. If someone's paying them, they'll take anyone they can grab. The boy stood back, listening quietly, his chest tight. The vendors were angry, scared. If the guards kept tightening their grip, it wouldn't just be the secret sellers in danger. It would be everyone. The boy finally moved on, weaving through the twisting alleys until he reached the small room where he lived. The other apprentices were gone, likely still working. He sat on the mat, staring at the wall, waiting for the sun to sink. When the evening bells finally rang, he rose and tucked his shirt tighter around him. His steps were slow as he made his way back through the winding alleys, the sky turning deep blue as the last light faded. When he reached the old building, the door was already open, a dim lantern glowing inside. He stepped in, and the room felt different tonight, tense, heavy. At least 8 people sat or stood around the table, their faces half hidden in the flickering light. Some he recognized from the market, others he didn't. All of them looked wary, their eyes darting from one another as if searching for cracks in the walls. The scarred man stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The girl sat near him, calm as always, her fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. The boy stood near the doorway, unsure where to go. The man's voice broke the silence. Someone's talking to the guards, he said bluntly. They've been too quick, too sure. Yesterday's arrest wasn't chance. Today, one of ours was chased. His eyes flicked briefly toward the boy before looking back at the others. We can't sell again until we know who's doing it. A man near the table spat on the ground. You think one of us would risk everything? We'd be fools to talk. The scarred man's voice stayed calm. Maybe someone's scared. Maybe someone's been caught and promised safety. Maybe someone just wants the coins for themselves. I don't care why, but if we don't find them, we'll all end up on that platform. Murmurs rippled through the group. Nervous glances exchanged. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying through the room. Whoever it is, they'll slip. They'll say the wrong thing. We just need to watch carefully. The boy felt his chest tighten under her gaze. Was she looking at him longer than the others? Or was it just his imagination? The scarred man slammed his hand against the table again, silencing the murmurs. We'll meet again tomorrow night. Until then, no one sells, no one talks to anyone outside this room. If the guards catch another one of us, we'll know exactly where to look. The room went quiet again, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The boy's palms felt damp. He wanted to leave, to get away from all of them, but he stayed frozen in place, his heart beating too fast. The girl finally looked away, but not before her sharp eyes lingered on him just a second too long. And in that moment, the boy felt it fully for the first time. It didn't matter if he was innocent. If they decided he was the traitor, he wouldn't survive long enough to explain. The boy left the meeting with his head low, slipping into the cool night air as the others filed out in small groups. No one spoke on the way out. The silence was heavier than shouting would have been. Every pair of eyes seemed to linger on someone else, measuring, judging, wondering who could be trusted. The boy kept his steps steady, though his chest felt tight. The alley stretched dark and narrow ahead of him, the only sound the faint drip of water from a broken gutter. His thoughts raced. He had done nothing wrong, but what if that didn't matter? The scarred man had said they would meet again tomorrow night. But what if they decided not to wait? What if tonight, someone decided they'd rather kill the traitor before the guards came knocking? He felt a presence behind him and tensed, his steps quickening. But when he glanced back, it was only a woman from the meeting, her face hidden under a scarf. She passed him without a word, turning sharply down another alley. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back in his small room, he lay awake long after the other apprentices had fallen asleep. He kept replaying the girl's expression in his mind. She hadn't accused him directly, but her eyes lingered too long, her questions too sharp. Maybe she didn't trust anyone, or maybe she already knew more than she was saying. And then there was the scarred man. His anger felt real, but the boy wondered, had he been the one to give the guards information? What if this whole meeting was just a performance to keep the others from suspecting him? By morning, the boy's eyes burned from lack of sleep. He forced himself into the market as usual, carrying his basket, but his movements felt mechanical, his smile forced. He didn't sell much. People's faces looked different today. The usual noisy bargaining was quieter, more careful, as if everyone feared the guards might be listening. At one corner, two vendors whispered furiously, their faces red from anger. The boy caught bits of their words as he passed. "They searched my stall again," one hissed. "So they got a tip." "A tip," they said. "Who's tipping them off?" The other vendor spat on the ground. "Whoever it is, they're killing us all. I lost a whole day's goods yesterday. They took everything just to check for stolen goods." The boy kept walking, but their words clung to him. The guards were already tightening their grip. It was only a matter of time before someone else was dragged to the square. By midday, he found himself near the fish stalls, the smell of salt and rot thick in the air. A group of vendors stood huddled together, not selling, just whispering. He recognized one of them from last night's meeting, a thin man with quick hands who usually sold herbs. The boy edged closer, pretending to inspect a basket of cheap fish, listening. "Don't care what the scar man says," the herb seller muttered. "If someone's talking, we should deal with it now." A woman beside him frowned. "You mean?" The herb seller gave her a sharp look. "You know what I mean. Better one traitor gone than all of us hanging." The boy's stomach twisted, his grip tightening on his basket. He slipped away before they could notice him, his heart pounding faster with every step. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the streets in golden shadows, the boy had sold barely anything. His master would be angry, but that was the least of his worries now. When evening came, he made his way back to the old building, each step heavier than the last. The lantern light flickered faintly inside, casting the scarred man's shadow long against the wall. The room felt even more tense than the night before. The same faces were there, but now they avoided looking directly at one another. A couple of them muttered quietly, but their words were too low to hear. The girl sat in the same spot as before, her calm expression unchanged. The scar man raised a hand, silencing the whispers. "We've had no new arrests today," he said, "but that doesn't mean we're safe. The guard are still searching stalls, asking questions. Someone's still talking to them." His eyes swept across the room, lingering just long enough on each person to make them shift uncomfortably. The boy tried to keep his face steady, but his hands clenched in his lap. The man continued, his tone harder now. "We don't have time to wait for another mistake. So we're changing how we work. From now on, no one knows who they're selling to except for the people I choose. You don't move a single grain of sugar or pepper without me or her." He nodded to the girl, "Giving you a name. And if anyone talks to the wrong person," his eyes narrowed, his voice dropping lower, "you won't need to worry about the sheriff. You'll have to answer to me first." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at the table. The girl finally spoke, her voice quiet but cutting through the tension. "If the guards are this close already, they're not just guessing. Someone's giving them details they shouldn't have. Names, goods, where we meet." The boy's chest tightened. She was right. The guards couldn't have found that vendor yesterday by chance. But if she was so sure, why hadn't she accused anyone yet? The scarred man gave a slow nod. "We'll find out who it is soon enough. But until then, no one leaves without giving me their full list of buyers. If you have a problem with that, you can walk away right now." No one moved. The man's gaze swept across the room again, pausing briefly on the boy. The boy tried to keep still, to look calm, but his heart pounded too fast, and he felt the girl's sharp eyes on him again. When the meeting ended, people left in pairs or alone, quiet and tense. The boy lingered near the door, waiting for a chance to slip out unnoticed, but the girl stood as he moved past. "Walk with me," she said simply. The boy hesitated. "Why?" Her eyes stayed steady, unreadable. "Because I said so." The scarred man didn't look up as they stepped outside. The alley was dim, the lantern light fading behind them as they walked. The girl's steps were quiet, her hands tucked into her sleeves. They walked in silence for a while before she finally spoke. "You're nervous." The boy glanced at her quickly. "Everyone's nervous. But not like you," she said calmly, her eyes fixed ahead. "You look like you're waiting for someone to accuse you." The boy's stomach twisted. "I didn't tell anyone anything," he said quickly. She didn't answer at first, her steps steady, her face unreadable in the dim light. Finally, she said softly, "I believe you." The boy blinked, surprised. "You do?" The girl gave him a faint glance. "If you were the traitor, you wouldn't be this scared. People who talk to the guards act braver, like they already feel protected." The boy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But then her tone shifted slightly, lower, colder. "That doesn't mean everyone else feels the same. If someone decides you're guilty, you won't have time to explain. So you'd better stay quiet and do exactly what you're told." The boy nodded quickly, his chest tight again. The girl stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "And if you hear anyone saying something strange, anything about the guards, anything about who they're watching, you come to me first. Understand?" The boy hesitated, then nodded again. She studied his face for a moment longer, then finally turned and disappeared down another alley, leaving him standing alone. The boy looked around the dark street, the night air sharp and cold. For the first time since he had started this, he wondered if staying alive meant being more afraid of the people he worked for than the guards themselves. And somewhere in the distance, faint but clear, a bell rang from the square, marking another public punishment. The boy didn't go straight home that night. His feet carried him through the quieter alleys, his ears tuned to every sound. He couldn't stop thinking about what the girl had said. "If you hear anything strange, you come to me first." But what did strange mean anymore? Every vendor looked suspicious now. Even the way people talked had changed. Conversations that used to be casual were now whispered, faces turned away as if afraid of being overheard. The next morning, the market felt even tighter with tension. Guards patrolled in pairs now, their heavy boots echoing against the stones. They stopped vendors at random, asking questions, lifting lids off baskets to search for hidden goods. The boy kept his head down as he moved through the square. He wasn't carrying anything for the secret trade today, just his usual pies, but his hands still felt sweaty on the basket handle. Near the corner, two guards questioned a fish seller, lifting each piece of fish from her basket as she protested weakly. "I've been selling here for years. Ask anyone," she pleaded. One guard, a tall man with a scar over his brow, barely looked at her. "The sheriff's orders. Anyone could be hiding things." The boy recognized him. He wasn't the one who had tried to grab him 2 days ago, but his presence made the boy's chest tighten anyway. The fish seller finally sagged with relief when they moved on, but her face stayed pale, her hands trembling as she rearranged her stall. The boy turned away, moving down a narrower street where fewer guards patrolled. It was there he saw something that made him stop. The herb seller from the secret meetings stood at a corner, speaking to someone in a dark cloak. The boy couldn't hear their words from this distance, but their posture was sharp, quick, almost tense. The cloaked figure handed the herb seller a small folded note before slipping away toward the main square. The boy ducked behind a stack of crates, watching as the herb seller glanced around nervously before tucking the note under his shirt and hurrying off in the opposite direction. The boy's mind raced. Was that a normal buyer? Or is it something else? He thought of the girl's warning. If you hear anything strange, you come to me first. But would she believe him? And if she didn't, would the herb seller hear that the boy had been asking questions? The boy waited until the street was empty before slipping back into the crowd. Later that day, he stopped by the alley where some of the regular vendors gathered to talk during quiet hours. He stayed at the edge of the group, pretending to adjust his basket while listening. The gray-haired man he had overheard before spoke again, his voice low and bitter. The guards came to my stall this morning. Asked if I'd seen anyone selling sugar or pepper. Told them no, of course, but they didn't believe me. Turn over half my goods anyway. Another man spat on the ground. They don't care what's true. The sheriff wants someone to blame. Sooner or later, they'll take whoever's easiest to catch. The boy kept silent, but his mind turned back to the herb seller. What if the guards aren't guessing anymore? What if someone is giving them real names? By evening, the sun was sinking, and the boy made his way back to the old building for the second night of meetings. The lantern glowed faintly inside. The same faces gathered again around the table. The scarred man stood as before, his arms crossed, his eyes sweeping the room. The guards are getting bolder, he said flatly. They're asking questions in every street now. But they're not guessing. They're too sure about who to watch. That means someone is still talking. A murmur rippled through the group, sharper than before. Someone slammed a fist against the table. Then why are we still sitting here? We should deal with it now before they drag us all away. The scar man's eyes narrowed. You think I don't want to? But I'm not killing anyone without proof. The herb seller shifted in his seat, his hands twitching slightly. The boy watched him closely, remembering the note. The girl's calm voice cut through the noise. Someone here is nervous. More nervous than they should be. The room quieted instantly, all eyes turning toward her. She didn't look at anyone directly, just traced a finger along the table. The guards don't know about this place. Not yet, but if they do soon, we'll know why. The boy felt her words like a cold weight in his chest. If the guards came here, everyone would be caught, and anyone could blame anyone else to save themselves. The scar man finally nodded. We'll tighten things more. No one meets with buyers without me. No one talks to anyone outside this room. His gaze swept across them, landing briefly on the herb seller before moving on. The boy stayed quiet, but his hands clenched tighter in his lap. When the meeting ended, people left in the same tense silence, but the boy lingered near the door until the others had gone. The girl stayed seated, her eyes following him as he approached. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low. I saw something today. The herb seller. He was talking to someone in a cloak. They gave him a note. The girl tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing just enough to show she was interested. Did he see you? The boy shook his head. The girl leaned back slightly, her expression calm again. Good. Don't tell anyone else. Not even him. The boy swallowed hard. What if he? Don't ask what if, she interrupted. Just watch him. If he's the one talking to the guards, he'll make another mistake soon. The boy nodded slowly, but a shiver ran through him. If the herb seller noticed he was being watched, what would he do? The girl stood, her steps light as she moved toward the door. You did the right thing, she said softly as she passed him. The boy stayed behind for a long moment, staring at the flickering lantern. But as he finally stepped outside into the cold evening air, a new fear gnawed at him. Because now, if the herb seller really was the traitor, and he suspected the boy knew, he wouldn't wait for the scar man to deal with it. And if he wasn't the traitor, the boy had just made himself another enemy for no reason. The next morning came with a heavy mist clinging to the streets, softening the edges of the buildings and muffling footsteps. The boy moved carefully through the market, his basket light with only a few pies, but his mind weighed down with the task ahead. He kept glancing toward the herb seller's usual spot near the edge of the square. The man sat hunched over his stall, arranging bundles of dried plants, his quick hands moving too fast for someone selling to casual buyers. The boy lingered near a fruit stand, pretending to check the bruised apples while keeping his eyes on him. Hours passed slowly. The herb seller spoke to a few regular customers, exchanging coins for herbs, but nothing unusual happened. The boy's legs ached from standing so long, but he didn't move far. Finally, just past midday, the herb seller packed his goods earlier than usual. That alone was strange. No vendor left before the best-selling hours unless they had somewhere important to be. The boy followed at a distance, weaving through the crowd. His heart pounded as he kept to the edges of the street, making sure not to get too close. The herb seller turned down a narrow side alley, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing into the mist. The boy waited a few seconds before following, his footsteps soft against the damp stones. The alley twisted sharply, the walls close on either side, but when he rounded the corner, he stopped short. The herb seller stood near the far end, speaking quietly to the same cloaked figure the boy had seen yesterday. The boy pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. "Can't keep meeting like this," the herb seller muttered. The cloaked figure's voice was low, almost calm. "The sheriff wants names. You know what happens if you stop helping." The boy's breath caught. He had been right. The herb seller's voice grew sharper. "I've already told you who was selling in the west corner last week. Isn't that enough?" "Not for the sheriff," the cloaked figure replied. "He wants the ones running it, not just the sellers. Keep listening. Keep giving names, or you'll be the next one tied to the post." The boy's stomach twisted as he pressed closer to the wall, every muscle tense. The cloaked figure handed the herb seller a folded note, just like before. The herb seller stuffed it into his shirt and glanced around nervously before walking away in the opposite direction. The boy stayed frozen against the wall until the alley was empty. His hands trembled as he stepped back into the main street, his mind racing. He had proof now. The herb seller was the one talking to the guards. But telling the scar man or the girl wasn't as simple as it seemed. What if the herb seller suspected him first? What if the guards found out the boy had overheard them? The boy forced himself to keep walking, blending back into the market as if nothing had happened. By evening, he returned to the old building, the lantern glowing faintly inside as before. The same faces gathered again, but the tension was thicker tonight. Some whispered quietly. Others sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. The scarred man stood as usual, his voice hard. "The guard searched 2 more stalls today. They're getting closer. If anyone here is still talking, now is your last chance to admit it." Silence filled the room. No one moved. The girl's sharp eyes scanned each face, lingering briefly on the herb seller, whose hands twitched slightly as he adjusted his sleeves. The boy swallowed hard, his palms damp. Should he speak now? But if he said something and they didn't believe him, the scar man finally slammed his hand against the table. "Fine, but if I find out someone here's been lying to me, you won't get to explain before I deal with you." The boy's chest tightened as he glanced at the herb seller, whose eyes flicked toward him for just a fraction of a second before looking away again. When the meeting ended, people left quickly, tension snapping between them like pulled wires. The boy stayed behind again, his decision weighing heavily on him. The girl was still seated, her calm expression unchanged, but her eyes shifted to him the moment the door closed. "You have something to tell me," she said quietly, as if she already knew. The boy hesitated. I followed the herb seller today." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "He met someone?" The boy continued, his voice lower now. "The same cloaked man as before. I heard them talking. He's giving names to the guards." The man said, "The sheriff wants the ones running it." The girl's expression didn't change much, but her eyes sharpened, a cold glint appearing for the first time. "Are you sure?" she asked. The boy nodded quickly. "I heard everything." The girl leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Good. Don't tell anyone else." "Not yet." The boy blinked. "What are you going to do?" The girl's gaze turned toward the door, her tone soft but firm. "The scarred man will want proof before he makes a move." and I want to know how much the herb seller has already told the guards. If we act too soon, he might warn them." The boy swallowed hard. What if he suspects I followed him? The girl finally looked at him again, her expression calm, but her voice colder now. "Then you need to stay very quiet until we're ready. If he thinks you know too much, he won't wait for us to deal with you. Do you understand?" The boy nodded quickly, his chest tight. The girl stood, her movements smooth as she headed for the door. "Go home. Tomorrow, act normal. Watch him again if you can. But don't get caught." The boy stayed in the room for a moment after she left, his heart still racing. The flickering lantern cast long shadows against the walls, making the empty room feel heavier. He had done the right thing, he told himself. But as he finally stepped into the cool night, his steps quickening toward home, one thought kept twisting in his mind. If the herb seller was already giving names, how long before the guards knew exactly who the scarred man and the girl were? And when that happened, would any of them survive long enough to stop him? The boy barely slept that night. Every creak of the wooden walls made him flinch. Every muffled sound outside his window made him wonder if someone was coming for him. He kept seeing the herb seller's face in his mind, that brief flicker of suspicion when their eyes had met in the meeting room. When morning finally came, the mist clung to the streets again, thick and damp. The market felt even heavier with unease. Guards patrolled in pairs, their armor catching the weak sunlight. Vendors called out prices, but their voices were low, strained. The boy forced himself to keep to his routine, selling pies, calling out as if nothing had changed. But his eyes stayed fixed on the herb seller's stall across the square. The herb seller looked tense today. His hands moved quickly, but he glanced over his shoulder too often, his sharp eyes darting to every corner. The boy tried to act casual, weaving through the crowd as if heading toward another stall. He lingered near a cart piled with cabbages, pretending to examine the wilted leaves while watching him. Just past midday, the herb seller began packing his goods again, faster than the day before. The boy's heart quickened as he slipped into the moving crowd, staying a few steps behind. The herb seller took a different path this time, turning down a narrow street near the southern gate. The boy followed carefully, keeping to the edges, blending behind other vendors hauling baskets. Finally, the herb seller ducked into another side alley. The boy hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, peering around the corner just enough to see. The cloaked figure was waiting, his back to the wall. Their voices were low but urgent. "They're getting suspicious," the herb seller muttered, his tone tight. The cloaked man tilted his head slightly. "Who?" "Everyone. The scar man, even the girl. If they find out." The cloaked man cut him off. "Then give me the names now, before they move against you." The herb seller's hands shook slightly as he reached into his shirt, pulling out a small folded paper. "This is all I know for now. But after tonight's meeting." The boy leaned closer, his chest tight. He had to hear more, but his boots scuffed against the damp stones. The herb seller's head snapped up instantly. "Who's there?" The boy froze, his heart hammering. The cloaked man turned sharply, his hand going to the edge of his cloak. The boy ducked back behind the wall, pressing flat against it, his breath held. "Check it," the cloaked man ordered. The herb seller's footsteps moved closer, quick and sharp against the stones. The boy darted to the other end of the alley, slipping behind a barrel just as the herb seller rounded the corner. He crouched low, willing himself not to move, not to breathe too loud. The herb seller scanned the empty street, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the boy thought he had been seen, but then the herb seller muttered something under his breath and turned back. The boy waited until the sound of their voices returned, softer now, before slipping quietly away down another street. His heart pounded so fast it hurt, but he kept moving, weaving through the crowd until he reached the safer bustle of the main square. He wanted to run straight to the girl, to tell her everything, but he couldn't. If the herb seller suspected him now, going to her too soon might make it worse. The rest of the day dragged, every hour feeling heavier than the last. He couldn't stop replaying what he had heard after tonight's meeting. That meant the herb seller was planning to give the guards more names, maybe even the scarred man or the girl. By the time evening came, the boy's chest felt tight with dread. He made his way to the old building as usual, his steps slower than before. The room felt different tonight. The lantern light flickered more sharply, throwing long shadows across the walls. The scarred man stood stiffly at the table, his arms crossed, his eyes sharper than usual. The girl sat near him, her face calm, but her fingers tapped lightly against the wood, a quiet rhythm that betrayed her tension. The others shifted in their seats, some glancing nervously toward one another. The scar man's voice broke the silence. The guards searched 2 more vendors today. One of them was ours. They didn't find anything, but it's only a matter of time before they do. His gaze swept across the group. I said before, if anyone's talking, this is your last chance to say something. The boy glanced at the herb seller, who kept his eyes down, his hands resting stiffly on the table. The silence stretched longer this time, thicker, until the scarred man slammed his palm against the table, making the coins jump. Fine, he said coldly. But if the guards show up again, I won't wait for proof. The girl finally spoke, her tone calm, but cutting through the tension. They might not wait for another raid. If someone's been meeting them, they could strike tonight. Her eyes moved across the table, lingering for the briefest moment on the herb seller, who shifted slightly under her gaze. The boy's heart pounded as he watched. He wanted to speak, to shout out what he knew, but his throat felt tight. The meeting ended quickly, people leaving in pairs or alone again, but this time no one even tried to speak on the way out. The boy lingered near the door once more, his chest tight with the choice he still hadn't made. The girl rose from her seat, her eyes already on him. Walk with me, she said simply, just like before. He followed her out into the cool night, his steps unsteady. Did you watch him today? She asked quietly, not looking at him as they walked. The boy nodded. Yes, he's meeting them again. He gave them a paper. He said after tonight's meeting, he'd give them more names. The girl's face stayed calm, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Good. That's enough. The boy glanced at her nervously. What are you going to do? She didn't answer at first, her steps steady as they turned down a quiet alley. Finally, she said softly, you're going to stay out of the way. Go home. Act normal. Whatever happens tonight, you don't come back here unless I tell you. The boy's chest tightened. What are you going to do to him? The girl stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were calm, but her voice carried a quiet sharpness. If we don't deal with him, the guard will be here by morning. Do you understand what that means? The boy swallowed hard, nodding slowly. The girl gave him a final glance, then turned and disappeared into the deeper shadows of the alley, leaving him standing alone. The boy stood frozen for a long moment, his heart pounding. He should go home, just as she said. But as he finally turned toward the main street, a distant sound stopped him cold. Faint shouts, far off but growing louder, coming from the direction of the square. The boy's stomach twisted. Something was happening already. And whatever it was happening tonight. The shouts in the distance grew louder, carried on the cool night air. The boy froze in the middle of the street, his breath quickening. People were starting to rush past him, their footsteps sharp against the stones. Some vendors closed their stalls early, pulling cloths over their goods, as if trying to disappear before the trouble reached them. He wanted to run home, just as the girl had told him, but his feet didn't move. His mind raced with only one thought. If the guards were already moving, they might be heading straight for the old building. Against every instinct, the boy turned and began moving toward the noise, weaving through the crowd. His chest tightened with every step, the sound of shouting growing sharper. By the time he reached the edge of the square, the night was alive with chaos. A group of guards was pushing through the crowd, their armor glinting in the torchlight. People scattered to the sides, pulling carts and baskets out of the way. At the center of it all, a guard dragged a young vendor by the collar, throwing him to the ground. The vendor shouted protests, insisting he had done nothing wrong, but the guards didn't listen. One of them barked an order to tighten the line, blocking off the side streets. The boy crouched behind a cart, his heart pounding. The guard weren't just patrolling, they were searching. And if they were here, it meant the herb seller had already spoken to them. His eyes darted to the far side of the square, where he caught a glimpse of the herb seller himself, half hidden in the shadows. His face was tense, his hands twitching as he watched the guards work. The boy ducked lower, his mind racing. Should he run to the girl? Should he warn the scar man? But it was too late now. The guards were already here. A sudden movement made him stiffen. The herb seller turned and slipped into a narrow alley, moving quickly. The boy hesitated for only a second before following. The alley was dim, the walls close and damp. The boy kept his steps soft, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead of him. The herb seller moved fast, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting someone to follow. Finally, the herb seller stopped near a wooden door tucked into the side of the building, knocking quickly in a strange rhythm. The boy crouched behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. The door creaked open slightly, and a familiar voice spoke from the other side. The girl. "You're late," she said, her tone sharp. The herb seller glanced around nervously. "I can't stay. The guards are moving tonight. You need to leave before they." The girl's voice cut him off, quiet but dangerous. "You told them, didn't you?" The herb seller froze, his shoulders stiffening. "I didn't have a choice. They would have." The sound of footsteps echoed suddenly from the far end of the alley. The boy pressed back against the crates, his chest tight. The herb seller stiffened even more, glancing toward the sound. "They're coming. You have to." The girl stepped fully into the doorway now, her sharp eyes glinting in the torchlight spilling faintly from the square. She moved closer to him, her voice low and steady. "You ruined everything." The herb seller's breathing quickened. "I didn't mean." He didn't finish. The girl's hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve, pulling him closer so fast he stumbled. "You should have been more afraid of us than of them," she whispered. Before the boy could see what happened next, the heavy clatter of boots filled the alley. The herb seller jerked back in panic, tearing free from her grip, but the guards were already there. "Stop!" a guard shouted. The girl turned sharply, her calm mask slipping for the first time as the torchlight caught her face. The herb seller raised his hands quickly, shouting, "There! She's the one you want. She's—" The guards surged forward, their boots thundering against the stones. The girl moved fast, darting back through the doorway, slamming it shut behind her. The herb seller lunged toward the guards, pointing wildly at the door. "She's inside. That's where they meet." The boy's chest tightened painfully as he pressed lower behind the crates, trying to stay hidden. One guard slammed his fist against the door, shouting orders, while another began forcing it open with the butt of his spear. The herb seller stepped back, his hands still raised, but his eyes darted nervously toward the exit of the alley. Then in one quick motion, he turned and bolted. "Stop him!" one of the guards shouted, but two of them stayed focused on breaking through the door, while only one gave chase. The boy stayed frozen, watching as the herb seller disappeared into the mist. The door finally gave way with a sharp crack, swinging inward. The guards stormed inside, their shouts echoing against the walls. The boy's heart pounded as he crouched lower, torn between running now or staying to see what would happen. The sounds of chaos spilled from the building, shouts, the crash of something falling, the sharp clatter of overturned chairs. Then a different sound cut through it all, faint but distinct, a scream. The boy's breath caught as he gripped the edge of the crate, every muscle tense. He couldn't see inside, couldn't know what was happening, but the noise grew sharper, closer, like the fight was spilling toward the door. Suddenly, the door swung open again, and a figure burst through, stumbling into the alley. The scarred man. His face was flushed, his jaw tight, and in his hand he held something heavy wrapped in cloth. He didn't stop, didn't even glance at the boy as he ran toward the far end of the alley, disappearing into the mist. A guard appeared in the doorway a moment later, shouting for more men to block the exits. The boy's chest tightened as the chaos inside grew louder, the sound of more boots rushing toward the building. Somewhere deep inside, a crash echoed, followed by another scream. The boy stayed frozen, his heart hammering, his breath shallow. The girl was still inside, and whatever happened next would decide whether anyone walked out of that building alive. The noise from inside the building grew louder with every passing second. Shouts overlapped, boots pounded against wooden floors, and something heavy crashed against the wall, making the lantern above the alley door shake. The boy pressed tighter against the crates, his heart racing. His breath came shallow, almost too quiet to hear, but he could feel every thud of his heartbeat in his chest. Through the open doorway, shadows flickered wildly as torches swung inside. The smell of smoke and overturned oil lamps began to drift into the alley, mixing with the damp night air. Suddenly, two figures stumbled out of the doorway. One was a guard, gripping the arm of a struggling vendor, dragging him toward the alley. The vendor kicked and twisted, shouting, "I'm not one of them. I swear." The guard didn't even respond, hauling him toward the street where more soldiers waited. Another guard stepped into the alley, shouting for reinforcements, his voice sharp and commanding. The boy pressed lower, trying to stay hidden, but his eyes stayed fixed on the open doorway. The girl was still in there. A loud crash from inside made the guard spin back toward the building. Shouts turned into screams now, and for a moment it sounded less like an arrest and more like a fight. Then the girl appeared in the doorway. Her face was streaked with sweat, her hair loose from its usual neat tie, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She darted out of the door, glancing quickly toward the alley exit before moving the opposite way, back into the deeper shadows. The guards shouted when they saw her. "There! Stop her!" The girl didn't hesitate, turning sharply down the side passage that led to the narrower part of the alley. Two guards followed, their boots slamming against the stones. The boy's chest tightened. If she kept running that way, she would hit the dead end near the old wall. She wouldn't make it out. Before he could think, his body moved on its own. He slipped from behind the crates and ran in the opposite direction, toward the narrow turn where she had gone. The air felt heavy as he sprinted, his basket bumping against his side until he dropped it entirely, pies spilling across the stones. When he reached the corner, he pressed himself against the wall, peeking just enough to see. The girl had reached the dead end, her back against the rough stone, her chest rising and falling quickly. The two guards approached slowly, their spears raised, confident she had nowhere left to run. But she didn't look panicked. Her eyes stayed steady, calculating. "You should have stayed quiet," one of the guards said, his voice rough. The girl gave a faint smile, almost calm. "And you should have stayed out of our streets." The guard lunged forward, but she moved faster, darting to the side and grabbing the broken handle of a crate lying against the wall. She swung it sharply, knocking the spear aside with enough force to make the guard stumble. The second guard tried to grab her arm, but she twisted free, striking him across the chest before ducking under his reach. The boy's breath caught as she moved toward the corner where he was hidden. For a split second, her eyes flicked toward him, and something sharp passed between them, a silent command, or maybe just a warning. The guards recovered quickly, one of them shouting for backup. More footsteps pounded from the main alley, closing in. The girl darted closer to where the boy hid, slipping around the corner just as the guards lunged again. She grabbed his sleeve, pulling him deeper into the narrow space between two buildings. "Don't say a word," she whispered, her voice low and steady. The boy nodded quickly, his heart pounding so hard it almost drowned out the sound of the guards rushing past. They crouched in the shadows as the guards thundered by, shouting to each other. "She's heading toward the east wall. Cut her off." The girl stayed completely still, her breathing controlled despite the chase. She didn't move until the last of the footsteps faded, swallowed by the chaos spilling through the streets. Finally, she released his sleeve, glancing at him with sharp eyes. "You shouldn't be here." The boy swallowed hard. I had to see if you got out." Her expression didn't soften, but she gave a small nod, as if accepting it without words. More shouting echoed from the main alley. The guards were dragging more vendors out of the building now. Somewhere in the distance, someone screamed, followed by the clatter of overturned stalls. The girl crouched lower, peering through the narrow gap between the buildings. Her voice dropped even quieter. "It's worse than I thought. They're taking everyone." The boy hesitated. "The scarred man, did he?" "He got out," she said quickly, still watching the street. "But they'll hunt him next. And if the herb seller's still alive, he'll lead them straight to him." The boy's chest tightened. "What about the others inside?" The girl didn't answer at first, her jaw tight. Finally, she said softly, "Not everyone will make it out." The boy lowered his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. Suddenly, More footsteps approached, lighter this time, coming from the side alley. The girl tensed, gripping the broken crate handle tighter. A figure stumbled into view. The herb seller. His face was pale, his hair damp with sweat, and his eyes darted wildly as he ran past the corner, heading toward the southern street. The girl's eyes narrowed sharply. The boy whispered, "He's running to the guards, isn't he?" The girl didn't answer, but her gaze stayed locked on him as he disappeared into the mist. Finally, she turned to the boy, her voice low but steady. "You stay here. Don't move." Before he could respond, she slipped out of the shadows, moving quickly and silently after the herb seller. The boy stayed crouched, his chest rising and falling too fast, his ears full of the distant chaos. Every muscle in his body told him to stay where he was, to do exactly as she had said. But as he stared after her, the noise from the square grew louder, sharper, and something inside him twisted. If the girl didn't catch the herb seller before he reached the guards, everything would be over. The boy stood slowly, his heart pounding, and stepped out into the street. For the first time, he wasn't just watching anymore. He was going after them. The boy's feet pounded against the damp stones as he moved through the narrow streets, his breath quick and sharp in the cold night air. The mist clung to everything, making the streets feel smaller, quieter, though the distant noise of shouting still carried from the square. He followed the faint sound of hurried footsteps ahead, lighter than guards' boots, faster than a casual walk. The herb seller. Every turn of the winding alleys felt heavier with risk. If the guard spotted him now, they wouldn't stop to ask why a boy was running through the night. And if the herb seller reached them first, it would be too late to stop him. The boy slowed as he neared the southern street, pressing himself against a wall to listen. He could hear voices now, low but tense. The herb seller was talking to someone, but it wasn't the guards. The boy edged closer, crouching behind a stack of barrels. Through the mist, he could see the herb seller standing in the corner of a side passage, speaking in hurried whispers to a man whose face was half hidden by a hood. The boy strained to hear. "You told me you'd get me out of the city," the herb seller said, his voice sharp. "You said if I gave the sheriff names, you'd help me leave before they started rounding everyone up." The hooded man's tone stayed calm, almost too calm. "Plans changed. The sheriff wants to make an example. He's not letting anyone slip away until it's done." The herb seller stepped closer, his voice rising. "You promised. I gave you everything. I told you where they meet, who's running it." The hooded man's hand moved to his belt, cutting him off. "Lower your voice. The sheriff doesn't care what you were promised. You've been useful. That's all that matters." The herb seller froze, his breathing quick. "What are you saying?" The hooded man finally looked at him fully, his expression cold in the dim light. "I'm saying you're not leaving. And if you make trouble, you'll be standing next to the others when the sheriff hangs them in the square." The boy's breath caught. The herb seller hadn't just betrayed them. He had been betrayed too. The herb seller stepped back, his voice trembling now. No, you said." The hooded man moved fast, grabbing his arm in a firm grip. "You talk too much. If you want to stay alive long enough to see the morning, you'll keep quiet." The herb seller yanked free suddenly, stumbling back a step. His face twisted, anger breaking through his fear. "I won't let you," he shouted louder now. The hooded man cursed, stepping forward quickly, but the herb seller turned and bolted, sprinting toward the narrower streets. The boy pressed himself lower behind the barrels as the hooded man hesitated, glancing after him but not giving chase. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the mist toward the square. The boy stayed still for a long moment, his heart racing. The herb seller wasn't running to the guards now. Not anymore. The boy stood slowly, peering down the street where the herb seller had gone. His mind raced with what he had just heard. The guard weren't going to protect the herb seller. They were going to use him and then throw him away. And if the herb seller realized that, what would he do now? The boy started moving again, following the same path, his steps quieter this time. The streets grew darker as he followed the twists of the alleys, his ears tuned to every sound. Finally, he caught sight of the herb seller again, crouched near a wall, his chest rising and falling quickly as he tried to catch his breath. The boy ducked into a shadowed doorway, watching. The herb seller's hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead, muttering to himself, "They're not going to hang me. They're not." His voice cracked slightly, turning to anger. "I gave them everything. I won't be the one they take." The boy felt his stomach twist. The herb seller wasn't running to save himself anymore. He was desperate enough to do anything now. The herb seller stood suddenly, his movements sharp. He turned back toward the market square, his steps quickening. The boy's chest tightened as he followed, staying just far enough behind to keep hidden. The herb seller wasn't running to the guards. He was heading back toward the chaos. As they neared the square, the noise grew louder again. Guards shouting, vendors crying out, the crack of wood as stalls were overturned. The air smelled faintly of smoke now, drifting through the mist. The herb seller slipped into the crowd gathering at the edge of the square, moving quickly but not running. The boy followed, weaving between people trying to get out of the way. When the boy finally pushed close enough to see, his breath caught. The guards had lined several vendors against the wall, their hands bound, their faces pale. The sheriff stood near the center, his voice sharp as he gave orders. The herb seller moved closer, his head low, but his eyes darted sharply toward the group. And then the boy realized what he was going to do. The herb seller wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to name more names, give more people to the sheriff. Not because he was loyal, but because he thought it might save him if he gave them everyone. The boy's hands clenched as he stepped closer, the noise of the crowd swallowing his quick breaths. He had to warn the girl, had to warn the scarred man, anyone who was still free. But if the herb seller spoke before he could reach them, it would be too late. The boy's chest tightened as he moved closer to the edge of the square. The herb seller was only a few steps from the sheriff now, his lips pressed tight, his eyes darting nervously. And then, for just a moment, the herb seller's gaze shifted, landing directly on the boy. The boy froze, his heart stopping. The herb seller's eyes narrowed sharply, recognition flashing across his face. And in that instant, the boy knew. The herb seller wasn't going to name the scarred man first. He was going to name him. The boy's heart pounded so hard it felt like the sound might give him away. The herb seller's sharp eyes stayed locked on him for what felt like forever, and then the man's expression shifted, narrowed, calculating, as if a single choice was forming in his mind. The sheriff barked an order to his men, but the herb seller moved closer to him, his steps quick now, his voice rising above the noise of the crowd. "I know who's with them," he shouted, his voice breaking slightly. "The others are still here. I can show you." The sheriff turned sharply, raising a hand for silence. The crowd quieted, vendors pressing against the walls, eyes wide with fear. "Who?" the sheriff demanded. The herb seller pointed suddenly, his arm shooting out, his fingers shaking slightly. "There!" His voice cracked, almost shrill. "The boy. He's with them. He's been watching for them all week." The boy froze. Dozens of eyes turned to him at once, the crowd parting slightly as the guards shifted, their attention snapping toward him. The boy's body moved before his mind caught up. He bolted, darting through the nearest gap in the crowd as people shouted and scattered. "Stop him!" the sheriff yelled. The boy didn't look back. His feet pounded against the stones as he pushed past carts and ducked under hanging cloths, the shouts of guards growing louder behind him. He darted into a side alley, his breath ragged, his chest burning. The narrow passage twisted sharply, and he slid against the damp wall to keep his balance. Boots thundered behind him, closer now. He turned another corner, but as he reached the end of the alley, a figure stepped into his path. The girl. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharper than he had ever seen. "They're after you," she said quickly, her voice low but firm. The boy nodded, his breathing uneven. "The herb seller," he told them. "It's me now." "I know," she interrupted, glancing past him toward the sound of approaching guards. She stepped closer, her grip suddenly firm on his arm. "You need to listen to me. Do exactly as I say. If you don't, they'll catch you before you take 3 more turns." The boy nodded quickly, his heart racing. She let go of his arm and pointed to a narrow wooden door half hidden by a tattered cloth. "Through there. Stay low and follow the back passage until you reach the courtyard. Don't stop for anything. I'll find you when it's clear." The boy hesitated. What about you? The girl's jaw tightened slightly. I'll take care of him. Before the boy could answer, the sound of boots grew louder. The girl gave him a sharp look, her voice dropping to a whisper. Go. Now. The boy darted toward the door, slipping inside just as the first shadows of guards appeared at the alley's entrance. The passage was dark and narrow, the air damp and musty. He crouched low as he moved, his hands brushing the rough walls for balance. His heart still pounded, every distant shout making him flinch. Finally, he reached the end, pushing through a half-broken gate into a small courtyard overgrown with weeds. The night was quieter here, the noise of the square muffled by the high walls. He crouched behind a stack of barrels, trying to catch his breath, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What was the girl going to do? Would she catch the herb seller before he gave more names? The boy pressed his forehead against the barrel, willing himself to stay still, to wait as she had told him. But then, faintly, he heard something, shouts again, closer now, coming from the direction of the square. And mixed with them, he thought he heard her voice. He rose slightly, peering through the gap in the broken gate. The mist had thickened again, but through it, he could just make out two figures moving fast near the edge of the square. One of them stumbled slightly, his movements panicked, frantic. The herb seller. The other figure moved with sharp precision, closing in with every step. The girl. The boy gripped the edge of the barrel, his heart hammering harder. The herb seller darted between stalls, shouting for the guards. Here. She's here. She. The girl moved faster, cutting him off before he could finish. She lunged, grabbing his sleeve, spinning him around so quickly he nearly fell. The herb seller struggled, trying to pull away, his voice rising in panic. You can't stop this. They'll catch you. They'll. The girl's voice cut through sharply, though the boy couldn't hear the words. The herb seller tried to jerk free again, but she didn't let go. Her other hand shot up, grabbing the collar of his shirt, pulling him close, her face inches from his. For a moment, they stayed like that, frozen in the mist, their voices too low to hear. Then something unexpected happened. The herb seller stopped struggling. His shoulders slumped slightly, his head dropping as if something had broken inside him. The girl didn't release him, but her grip loosened just enough for him to look up at her, his face pale, his expression torn between anger and something else. Regret, maybe. The boy leaned closer, straining to hear, but the shouts of guards echoed again, closer now. The girl's head turned sharply toward the sound, and in that split second, the herb seller moved. Not to run, to shout. Here. They're here. His voice cracked, echoing through the mist. The girl's hand tightened again, her expression hardening instantly. But it was too late. Boots pounded against the stones, torches glinting in the fog. The sheriff's voice carried over the noise, sharp and commanding. Surround them. The girl spun, releasing the herb seller, her eyes darting toward the nearest escape. But the square was already closing in, shadows of guards moving from every side. The boy crouched lower behind the barrels, his chest tight, his breath caught in his throat. She wouldn't make it out this time, not with the guards so close. Unless. The boy's hands tightened against the wood as his mind raced. Unless he did something. For the first time, the choice wasn't about running or hiding. If he stayed crouched here, she'd be caught. But if he moved, if he did anything, the guards would see him too. His heart pounded faster, his hands trembling. The girl glanced once toward the alley where he hid, her eyes catching his for just a second through the mist. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a command. But in that look, he knew exactly what she expected him to do. And in the next breath, the boy stood. The boy stepped out from behind the barrels before he could think, his legs moving faster than his mind. His heart pounded in his chest as he darted into the open, the mist curling around his feet. Over here, he shouted, his voice louder than he thought possible. The guards turned sharply at the sound, their torches swinging toward him. For a moment, the square froze, all eyes snapping to the small figure standing at the edge of the chaos. The boy didn't stop. He ran, weaving between overturned carts and broken stalls, his movements quick and wild enough to draw every pair of eyes. The sound of boots followed instantly, shouts echoing through the mist. "Get him! Don't let him get away!" the sheriff barked. The boy's lungs burned as he darted through the narrow spaces, his only thought to keep them chasing him. Behind him, the sound of the girl's steps shifted, softer, moving in the opposite direction as she slipped deeper into the shadows. It was working, but the boy knew he wouldn't last long. His legs ached, his breathing sharp, and every turn of the winding streets felt like it was closing tighter around him. He turned sharply down a narrow alley, his boots splashing through a puddle. The guards followed, their heavy steps slamming against the stones. The boy's chest tightened as he reached a dead end. The wall loomed in front of him, too high to climb, too rough to scale. He spun quickly, his back against the wall, his breath coming fast. The guards closed in, torches flaring in a mist. "Got you," one of them said, his voice cold. The boy's heart pounded as he pressed against the wall, his hands trembling. And then, before the guards could reach him, a voice cut through the chaos. "Stop! Don't touch him!" The guards froze, turning sharply. The sheriff stepped into the alley, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the boy. The herb seller stood behind him, his face pale, his hands still trembling. "That's him," the herb seller said quickly. "He's been with them since the start. He knows where the others are hiding." The sheriff's gaze hardened as he stepped closer to the boy. "Is that true, boy? You know where the rest of them are?" The boy swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't answer, couldn't even speak, his throat too tight with fear. But then, before the sheriff could press further, a sharp voice came from the other end of the alley. "He doesn't know anything." The girl stood there, her figure barely visible through the mist, but her voice was steady, almost calm. The sheriff turned sharply, raising his hand for his men to hold. "You," his tone shifted, a mix of triumph and anger. "You're the one who's been running this. It's over. Drop whatever you're hiding and step forward." The girl didn't move, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "You already have who you came for. You don't need him." The sheriff gave a cold smile. "I need all of you." The girl's eyes flicked briefly to the boy, then back to the sheriff. "Let him go, and I'll come with you." The boy's chest tightened. "No," he whispered, though no one heard him. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You think you're in a position to bargain?" The girl's tone didn't change. "If you try to take us both, neither of us will leave this alley alive. But if you want me, you'll let him walk out right now." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a sharp nod to his men. "Take the boy out," he ordered. Two guards stepped forward, their hands rough as they pulled the boy away from the wall. The boy struggled, shouting, "No, don't take her." She didn't. The girl's sharp glance silenced him instantly. "Go," she said quietly. The boy's chest ached as the guards dragged him past her. For just a moment, their eyes met. Her expression stayed calm, but in that glance, there was something unspoken. "Don't come back." The guards pulled him out into the open street, away from the alley, away from her. He twisted, trying to look back, but the mist swallowed the view quickly. The sheriff's voice carried faintly behind him. "Bind her." The boy stumbled as the guards pushed him forward, his chest tight, his hands shaking. They left him at the edge of the square, shoving him toward the crowd of terrified vendors who had been released after questioning. No one spoke to him. No one dared. The boy stood still, his mind racing. He wanted to run back, to fight, to do anything, but his legs wouldn't move. The girl was gone. And then, suddenly, the noise from the alley shifted, shouts, louder now, and then the sharp sound of something heavy crashing against stone. The guards near the square turned sharply, some rushing back toward the alley. The boy's heart pounded as he darted behind an overturned cart, his eyes fixed on the mist. Through the haze, two figures stumbled into view, guards dragging someone between them. The herb seller, not the girl. The herb seller's face was pale, his expression wild as he struggled against their grip. "No, you said I'd be safe. You said—" The sheriff's voice cut through, sharp and cold. "You lied to us. You held back names." The herb seller shook his head frantically. No, I told you everything. I swear." The sheriff's gaze hardened. "Take him to the square." The boy's stomach twisted. The girl wasn't with them, which meant he turned quickly, scanning the mist again, and for just a moment he saw her, a shadow slipping between stalls, moving fast toward the eastern gate. The boy's breath caught. She had escaped. The final twist hit him like a rush of air. She hadn't given herself up to save him. She had tricked the sheriff, used the herb seller as a distraction, and walked away while everyone watched the wrong person. The boy stayed crouched, his heart racing, as she disappeared into the mist. And for the first time since the night began, he felt a small, sharp smile tug at his lips. She was still free. But the war for the streets wasn't over. Not yet. The squares slowly quieted as the night deepened, though tension lingered in the air like a stubborn fog. The guards moved with slower steps now, dragging the herb seller toward the center where a few torches still burned. Vendors who hadn't been taken sat slumped near their stalls, their faces pale, their goods either trampled or gone. The boy stayed crouched behind the overturned cart, his breathing finally slowing. No one was paying attention to him anymore. All eyes were on the herb seller, who stumbled as he was forced to his knees. The sheriff stood over him, his expression cold, unreadable. "You said you gave us every name," the sheriff said flatly. The herb seller shook his head rapidly, his voice cracking. "I did. I told you everything. I swear." The sheriff crouched slightly, his sharp eyes studying him. "Then why was she still here? Why did she slip past us if you told me everything?" The herb seller froze, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You're useless to me now." The herb seller's voice cracked again, louder this time. "No, I can still help you. I can find her, The sheriff didn't respond, only straightened and signaled to his men. "Lock him up with the others. We'll decide what to do with him in the morning." The guards dragged him away as he shouted protests, his voice breaking in desperation, but no one listened. The boy sank lower behind the cart, his chest heavy. There was no joy in watching the herb seller fall apart like that, not even after his betrayal. For a moment, he almost pitied him. Almost. The guards began to pull back, their lines loosening as they prepared to leave the square. The sheriff gave a few quiet orders to the remaining men, pointing toward the alleys, but his voice was calmer now, less urgent. The chase was over for tonight. The boy stayed hidden until the last of the soldiers moved on. Only when the square grew quiet again, with just a few dim torches flickering, did he stand. His legs ached as he moved, stepping over broken wood and scattered baskets. The smell of smoke and wet stone lingered in the air. The vendors who had been released sat in small groups, whispering quietly to each other, their faces drawn and tired. No one looked up as he passed. Everyone was too lost in their own fear. He stopped near the center of the square, his eyes drifting toward the alley where he had last seen her slip away. The mist had thickened again, softening the edges of the buildings until they looked almost like shadows. She was gone, but she wasn't caught. The thought brought a strange mix of relief and something else he couldn't quite name. The boy walked slowly back toward the narrow streets, careful not to draw attention. His basket lay where he had dropped it earlier, the pies scattered and ruined, but he bent to pick it up anyway. The familiarity of it, even in pieces, felt grounding after the chaos. The streets were quieter now, the echo of boots replaced by the distant drip of water from rooftops. As he moved through the empty alleys, his mind replayed everything. The girl's steady voice, the scarred man running into the mist, the herb seller's last desperate plea. The night had changed everything, though he wasn't sure how yet. When he finally reached the small street near his home, he slowed. A single lantern flickered weakly in the distance, its light barely cutting through the fog. For a moment, he thought he was alone. Then a shadow shifted near the edge of the street. He stopped, his chest tightening, but the figure didn't move closer. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward. As the mist parted just enough, he saw her, leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes watching him. The girl. She looked tired, her hair loose around her face, but her posture stayed steady, controlled. "You shouldn't be out here," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. The boy tightened his grip on the broken basket. "Neither should you." For a moment, her lips curved slightly, the faintest hint of smile. Fair enough. They stood there in silence, the night wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Finally, he asked, "Why did you come back?" The girl's eyes didn't leave his. "I wanted to make sure you got home." The boy blinked, unsure how to respond. "But you tricked them. You should have kept going." "I did what I had to do," she said simply. "But you helped me tonight, whether you meant to or not. I don't leave people behind when they take risks for me." The boy shifted slightly, his chest tightening again. "Are they going to find you again?" The girl's expression grew more serious, her gaze drifting briefly toward the mist. "Maybe, but not tonight." The silence stretched between them again, broken only by the distant sound of a cart rolling over cobblestone somewhere far away. Finally, the girl stepped away from the wall. "Go home. Don't come looking for me again." The boy frowned slightly. "Will I ever see you again?" The girl's sharp eyes softened just enough to show something he couldn't quite name. Maybe gratitude, maybe something else. "Maybe," she said quietly. She turned, slipping back into the mist as silently as she had appeared, her figure fading until she was gone. The boy stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty street, before finally turning toward his own door. The night felt heavier somehow, but his steps were lighter, because for the first time, he understood something he hadn't before. Life on the streets was brutal, unfair, and filled with risks that could crush a person in a heartbeat. But sometimes, just sometimes, people found ways to fight back. And maybe one day he would too. As he stepped inside his small home and shut the door behind him, the mist outside curled thicker, swallowing the street in silence. But somewhere out there, in the twisting alleys of the city, the girl was still moving, watching, planning, waiting for the next night. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The boy sat quietly the next morning, his back pressed against the wooden wall of his small home. The pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, catching on the dust that hung in the still air. His basket sat beside him, half-mended, though his hands had stopped working on it long ago. His thoughts wandered to the square, to the alleys, to the girl who had vanished back into the mist before the sun rose. The streets outside were strangely quiet for morning. Usually by this time, the voices of vendors filled the air, calling out to customers, haggling over the price of bread or salted fish. But today, the voices were hushed, careful. The chaos from the night before lingered like a shadow over the city. He stood slowly, peeking through the shutters. The market square in the distance looked different now. Stalls had been pushed back into place, baskets and carts arranged to look as if nothing had happened. But there was no mistaking the change. Guards still walked along the edges, their faces hard, their hands resting near their weapons, as if daring anyone to speak too loudly. The vendors who had returned moved with careful steps, keeping their heads low as they laid out their goods. Some had bruises on their arms or faces. Others glanced nervously over their shoulders whenever a guard passed. No one called out to passing customers with the usual cheer. It was quieter, almost mournful. The boy stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face. He carried his basket under his arm, not because he had anything to sell, but because it felt strange to walk through the streets without it. He wandered toward the square, keeping to the edges, his steps slow. This was life for street vendors, he thought as he watched. Brutal, uncertain, and full of risks. Most of them earned barely enough to keep themselves fed, let alone to keep up with the taxes and bribes demanded by officials. Every day was a gamble. One bad sale, one spoiled batch of food, and a family might go hungry for days. And yet, even with the fear of soldiers, with the threat of punishment for anyone suspected of defiance, they still returned every morning. They had to. He paused near a cart stacked with stale bread. The vendor behind it, a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes, gave him a quick nod, but didn't speak. She was too busy watching guards. The boy moved on, his thoughts wandering. He had grown up among these people, selling pies since he was old enough to carry the basket, and yet he had never really thought about how much strength it took for them to keep going every day. Their lives were harsh, but they endured because there was no other choice. And sometimes, like last night, they fought in quiet ways, hiding each other, passing warnings, slipping bits of food to those who couldn't buy it. The scarred man, the girl, even the vendors who stayed silent instead of naming names. They were all part of something bigger, something he had only begun to understand. As he reached the far side of the square, he slowed again, his eyes drifting to where the herb seller had been dragged the night before. There was no sign of him now. Maybe he was locked away in one of the city's stone holding cells, or maybe the sheriff had already made his example of him. The boy didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet ache. The herb seller had chosen survival the only way he thought possible, even if it meant turning against his own people. That, too, was part of life here. Not everyone was brave enough to fight back. The boy found an empty crate near the edge of the square and sat down, resting his basket on his lap. The sunlight caught the mist as it burned away, leaving the streets sharper, clearer. He let himself imagine what the girl might be doing now. She was probably far from the square already, moving through back alleys, talking to people he had never noticed before, planning something bigger. She had looked calm last night, but he had seen the determination in her eyes. She wasn't done. He wondered if he would see her again. His fingers traced the edge of the basket slowly as he thought about it. Part of him wanted to stay safe, to keep selling pies and pretending none of this mattered. That was the easier choice. But another part of him, stronger now than it had been yesterday, wanted to do more. He had already taken one risk last night, stepping out of the shadows when he didn't have to. And the truth was, even if he tried to go back to his old life, things wouldn't feel the same anymore. Once he saw how much people were willing to fight for each other, how much courage hid in the quiet corners of the streets, it was impossible to unsee it. He sat there for a long time, listening to the soft sounds of vendors setting out their goods, the quiet murmur of early customers, and the distant clatter of a cart rolling over cobblestones. The city felt fragile this morning, as if one wrong move could shatter the uneasy calm the guard were trying to enforce. But it also felt alive in a way he hadn't noticed before. Even with all the fear, people still worked, still traded, still found ways to smile when they thought no one was looking. And maybe that was how people survived here, not just by selling, or hiding, or even fighting, but by refusing to give up, no matter how harsh the streets became. The boy finally stood, lifting his basket again. He didn't know if he would see the girl tonight, or tomorrow, or ever again. But if he did, he wanted to be ready. He took one last look at the square before turning back toward the alleys, the soft light of morning spilling across the worn stones. The city would go on, as it always did, and so would he. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Not for him, not for her, and not for the quiet fight that was beginning to grow in the shadows of the streets. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist and the noise of the market, the next story was already waiting. The boy walked home slowly, his steps dragging as the weight of the night settled in. The air smelled faintly of smoke, and the cobblestones were still wet from the mist that had clung to the streets for hours. It felt quieter now, calmer, but not in a comforting way. The market square, which had always been full of chatter and color, now carried a tension he could feel in every careful glance exchanged between vendors. He passed a woman he knew, a baker who used to smile when she saw him. Today she kept her head down, her eyes fixed on her loaves, as if looking at anyone for too long might draw suspicion. A fish seller adjusted his stall nervously, his hands shaking slightly as two guards strolled past. Everyone was back at work because they had no choice, but the fear hung over them like an unseen net, keeping their voices low and their movements slow. The boy kept walking, gripping the handle of his basket as if it might anchor him to something solid. His mind kept replaying what had happened. The chase, the shouting, the moment the girl had slipped into the mist while the herb seller was dragged away. He had watched her go, watched her vanish like smoke, and he wondered if she had planned every part of it from the start. For a long time, he had thought life as a street vendor was simple, just a daily struggle to sell enough food to survive. But last night had shown him something different. The vendors weren't just fighting to make a living. They were fighting to stay free, to stay human in a place where people like the sheriff treated them as pieces to be moved and discarded. He slowed as he neared the small alley that led to his home. The streets were still damp, puddles reflecting the pale morning light. Somewhere far off, a cart rattled over stones, and a woman called out for fresh bread, her voice low and careful. Life was already trying to return to its usual rhythm, but it didn't feel the same anymore. At his door, he stopped and turned slightly, glancing back toward the market square. Part of him expected to see her again, leaning against a wall or waiting in the mist like before. But there was nothing, only vendors going about their work under the quiet watch of the guards. He stepped inside, setting the basket down on the wooden table. The small room smelled of stale bread, and the walls felt closer than usual, but it was his home, his safe place. At least for now. He sat down, resting his elbows on the table, and let himself breathe for a moment. The herb seller's face flashed in his mind, not in anger this time, but in something close to pity. The man had been desperate, trapped in the same cycle as everyone else. He had made the wrong choice, but the boy couldn't help wondering if he would have done the same if he had been older, hungrier, more afraid. In the end, the herb seller had tried to save himself and failed, and now he was gone, likely locked away or worse. The boy's thoughts drifted back to the girl. She had risked everything not just to escape, but to protect him, even when she didn't have to. And she had done it with a kind of quiet strength he couldn't stop thinking about. She hadn't begged, hadn't pleaded. She had taken control of the chaos and walked away because she refused to let them win. He found himself smiling faintly at the thought. Somewhere out there, she was probably already moving, already planning what came next. People like her didn't stop. They couldn't. And maybe that was what gave him hope. The boy sat for a long time, letting the quiet hum of the morning settle over him. Outside, vendors began to raise their voices again, cautiously at first, then louder as the guards drifted away. Someone laughed, quickly muffled but still real, and the familiar smell of baking bread drifted through the air. Life was returning because it had to, but something had changed for him. He stood finally, picking up the basket. The edges were still cracked from where it had been thrown in the chase, but it would hold for another day. He tied the loose reed with careful fingers, his mind clearer now. He wasn't a fighter, not like the girl or the scar man. He was just a boy selling pies in the streets. But last night had taught him something important. Strength wasn't only in standing up to guards or slipping through alleys unseen. It was in surviving every day despite everything, in helping each other quietly, in refusing to give in to fear no matter how heavy it felt. That was what kept the city alive. Not the sheriff, not the guards, but the people who worked and endured even when the world tried to crush them. He stepped back into the street, adjusting the basket against his hip. The morning light had grown stronger, cutting through the mist that clung to the buildings. The vendors were louder now, voices rising as they called to customers, bargaining and arguing the way they always had. The boy joined them, his voice clear but not too loud as he walked through the familiar streets. It felt strange at first, but then, slowly, it felt right. People needed to hear those voices, needed to believe that things could still be normal. As he passed the square, he glanced once toward the corner where he had last seen her. The mist was gone now, replaced by sunlight, but he imagined her there anyway, watching. Maybe he would see her again. Maybe he wouldn't. But the thought didn't scare him anymore, because now he understood something he hadn't before. The streets belonged to them. The vendors, the children, the tired men and women who got up every morning no matter how hard the day before had been. The guard might have power, but they didn't have that kind of strength. And as long as that strength remained, there would always be people like her, people willing to fight quietly in the shadows, and people like him, learning how to stand even when the world seemed too heavy. The boy took a deep breath, the smell of fresh bread and spices mixing in the air. His steps grew lighter as he moved forward, calling out to customers with a steady, clear voice. The city lived on, and so did hope.